Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review another Badfinger album. I thought I'd reviewed all of them, but then I realised I hadn't reviewed Airwaves from 1979, so I've just recently got back into Badfinger, and I learnt the chords, the piano chords to Midnight Caller, which is a very nice song to play because it's a piano song on the record, and all these Badfinger, a lot of the Badfinger songs, the chords are available on ultimateguitar.com. So that's a great source of material for a budding piano player like myself. Bit of background. So this album, Wish You Were Here, had come out in the autumn of '74 and had not done very well, despite it being an excellent album, because the record company had to pull it because they had a dispute with the band over royalties and advances and stuff like that. So great shame, because the band really believed in that album and they thought they'd made a masterpiece, and it is a masterpiece, and maybe these days it's getting more recognition because Chris Thomas produced it, and I wrote to him in 1987 at Air Studios in London saying how much I loved it, and he wrote me a letter back basically saying thank you very much for your letter, John, and it means a lot to hear from someone like you, especially after all this length of time, and let's lobby for a CD release. Well, thankfully, it has now been released on CD and also released on vinyl, coloured green vinyl no less, so that was Wish You Were Here. Then the following early months of '75, they recorded an album called Head First at Apple, but it didn't get released. It was a bit of a hurried affair, and unfortunately Pete Ham's troubles were multiplying, and he was getting screwed by the management. They all were, and he was worried about his finances, and it all got on top of him, unfortunately, and he took his life on April 24th, 1975. By the way, I looked up, you can visit his grave in Swansea, so next time I'm there, I'll check it out. I forget the graveyard, but you can check it out. I'd like to pay my respects if I go to Swansea in the future. So basically, after Pete's death, Joey and Tom basically got disillusioned with the music business, not surprisingly, and just went and did manual work or were unemployed. And actually, this is a picture of Tom Evans in a factory in Surrey doing some kind of manual work, which is a bit sad to see. So that picture was given to me by a local in his local pub, because basically the story is I took the train from Wimbledon to Byfleet and Newhall, which is one of the lines down out of London from Waterloo, and because I knew that that's where Badfinger used to hang out, or Pete and Tom used to live, and there was a pub called the White Hart, which is mentioned in the Badfinger book written by that expert Dan, forget his second name. So it was a 10-minute walk from the station to the White Hart pub. I just went in there, ordered a drink, got talking to all the locals, and would you believe it, half of them knew Badfinger, and so I was talking to them for ages, had several pints, and I remember one lady was a bit disgruntled and was convinced that I was going to write a book about Badfinger, but I was just there as a fan, I said, and it was the truth. And so many pints later, I staggered back to the station and got the train back to Wimbledon, but that was a really nice few hours I spent with some of Tom and Pete's friends, because they spent a lot of time in the pub, so they obviously got to know a lot of the regulars. This is the album Airwaves they came up with in 1979. Joey and Tom tried to get Mike Gibbons, the drummer, involved, but he was a bit rusty, so they ended up with an excellent session drummer. I'm sure you've all heard of him, Andy Newmark, who'd played with George on the self-titled album a few months before this, and then the following year would play with John Lennon on Double Fantasy. And as James Griffiths said, he seems to get around and play with everyone. He played with Squeeze a few times, he played with Roger Waters, I'm sure there are many other people he's played with, so excellent drummer. And then also Nicky Hopkins features on this album, so even though Badfinger hadn't had a hit for several years, at least they were able to pull a few strings and get a few decent session men to play with them. And I guess expectations were reasonably high amongst the band and amongst the fans for this album. But I guess the worry was how could they fill the gap that Pete Ham had left, and that's actually what happened, because the record is decent, but it just lacks that Pete Ham quality that he brought to all the other albums. One has to say that, quite honestly, because there's some decent stuff on here. It's just not as consistent. This is my son's sealed copy of Airwaves, which I picked up in Houston a few years ago, and it wasn't too expensive. Nice to have that. So let's go through the tracks. This was the inner sleeve with a nice picture of Joey and Tom. This is on the Elektra label, which is a division of Warner Brothers, so same record company, interestingly enough, even though they'd had their problems before. I think Badfinger's happiest years were when they were on the Apple label, but even then they got looked after to begin with, and then got a little bit ignored towards the end because Apple was kind of fading in importance. Anyway, back to the album. Starts off with a little acoustic number called Airwaves, which is basically Tom Evans saying, I'd like to get back on the airwaves. It's not bad. Joey's playing guitar, nothing much. But then goes into quite a decent rocker, Look Out California, which is all about flying to California, been hanging around London town too long, and looking forward to laying down some music and getting back into the music business. And it's an upbeat song. It's just not a particularly memorable song, and even if one plays it loud, it's a little bit generic and doesn't do much for me. I think Tom has written better rockers in his life, like Blind Owl and Hey Mr. Manager and Rock and Roll Contract, to name but three. Anyway, the album really takes off with the next track, Lost Inside Your Love, which is a gorgeous Tom Evans ballad, trademark Badfinger harmonies, nice guitar solo from Joey, and just a gorgeous melody. And I think this was a single, didn't do much, but it should have done. And had it been released in the early 70s, it probably would have been a hit single. Because the thing about Tom Evans is he wasn't really writing much material. After the, even on Straight Up, he's only got It's Over, and he co-writes Money with Joey. On Ass, he's got 2 tracks. On Badfinger, he's got 2 tracks. On Wish You Were Here, he's got 1 track. So he was kind of, his songwriting was not as prolific as it was earlier on, because when they first came out, he was more or less the lead vocalist. When he sang the lead vocal on Maybe Tomorrow and Come and Get It, which was 2 of the earliest famous songs. But anyway, back to this album. This is Tom Evans rediscovering his talent and just showing he can lay down a great track, and it's beautiful. And the next track is even better, if that's possible. Love Is Gonna Come at Last. This is my favourite track on the album. I think it was a very minor hit single in the US, getting to 60-something. And this is just trademark Badfinger. This is what the fans wanted, and this is what the band delivered on, at least on this track. And lovely melody. Crank this one up loud. It's got a really nice sound. Andy Newmark's on drums. Actually, the sound is very similar to the self-titled track like If You Believe or something like that. Unfortunately, the last song on side 1 is a Joe Tansen song. Joe Tansen was the one who deserves the credit for getting this album together in the first place. He's a guitarist from Los Angeles, I think, and he knocked on Joey's door and said, "What are you doing?" And Joey rang Tom, so deserves credit for that. But unfortunately, the songs he contributes to this album are not on the same level as Joey's and Tom's. And the track Sympathy, although Tom Evans sings the lead vocal, it's a little bit derivative disco song, not very memorable. And then unfortunately, side 2 kicks off with another Joe Tansen song called The Winner, where again he's handed the lead vocal over to Joey and Tom, but they can't really rescue it. It's a bit of an awkward song, and a strange one to choose to open a side with as well. But then thankfully the album recovers significantly with The Dreamer, and the words are included here, and this is Joey's lovely tribute to Pete Ham. There was a young man, watched his life unfold each day. He only wanted to play, he only needed a ray. And then he found out one rainy afternoon he'd lost all he'd earned and was tossed in the rivers he's crossed. So this is a very poignant song, obviously, because Pete had passed and he would not grow old. Joey was lamenting that fact, and also repaying the tribute that Pete Ham had given him when Joey Molland had left the band. Pete Ham for the Head First album, which never came out. at the time. Did a song for Joey called Keep Believing. So this was Joey doing a tribute to Pete, which is nice to see, and it's a great tune. Very, very rousing vocal and performance. I love it. And then Come Down Hard is a nice rocker from Joey, based on the same chord structure as a song, the name of which I've forgotten, from the Natural Gas LP, which Joey Molland was in with Jerry Shirley from Humble Pie, which came out in '76. It's a decent song, nice guitar work, and then the album finishes very strongly with Sail Away, which is a lovely ballad with just Tom Evans singing and Nicky Hopkins playing his acoustic piano, and it's very moving. And so this album came out, didn't do much, unfortunately. I mean, a few of us fans bought it at the time, including myself. Not enough to push it into the charts, and then the record company dropped them. And then they had one more album left in them, which they had to put out on a private label called Radio Records, which they did in 1981, and that unfortunately didn't do anything either. I think Hold On was a minor hit in the US. They were on a couple of TV shows, but then Tom Evans unfortunately took his life in November '83, and there was no more Badfinger, although Joey Molland does still tour under the name Badfinger, and he's the only one left alive because Mike Gibbons, the drummer, passed away a few years ago as well. I had the pleasure of meeting Joey Molland in Liverpool in 1993, spent several hours with him. He's a lovely guy, and I think he's playing this year in Liverpool, and I'm very tempted, if I can arrange it with all this COVID stuff, very tempted to go up to Liverpool and see Joey, because he's playing with Earl Slick, Andy Newmark and Tony Levin, 3 members of the Double Fantasy Band. So that's more or less a dream lineup for me, so I'm going to try and do that. So that was Airwaves from Badfinger. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.